The Jordan Show on YouTube.
Ever feel like you're drowning in to-dos?
Yeah.
Like you're constantly busy, but not making any real progress on what actually matters.
Oh, yeah, I've been there.
I know I have too.
Hmm.
Which is why I'm excited to unpack this productivity powerhouse, the Eisenhower Matrix.
Yeah, the Eisenhower Matrix.
Have you heard of this?
I have.
Okay, awesome.
It's a deceptively simple tool, but it can be incredibly effective, especially when we understand its origins and potential limitations.
Right. And speaking of origins, it's named after Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, and later the 34th President of the United States. If anyone knew a thing or two about handling a massive workload, it was him.
Right.
This guy ushered in 2 states, signed bills like the Federal Aid Highway Act that led to the interstate highway system we know today,
Wow.
and even established NASA.
Busy guy.
That's exactly why this matrix, supposedly inspired by his methods, has resonated for decades. It's a visual way to cut through the noise and prioritize based on what's truly urgent and what's truly important. So paint us a picture here. What does this matrix actually look like?
Okay, so imagine a simple grid with 4 boxes. Across the top, we have importance, and down the side, urgency. This gives us 4 distinct quadrants to categorize our tasks.
Okay, I'm seeing those 4 boxes in my mind. Now let's fill them in. What kind of task goes where?
Okay, so let's start with the quadrant we all wish we could avoid. Urgent and important. These are the things that scream for immediate attention. Imagine a major project deadline looming, a client facing a critical issue that needs your expertise now, or a family member experiencing a sudden health crisis.
Yeah.
These are the drop everything and handle it situations.
Got it. The stuff that can make your heart skip a beat.
Exactly.
But that makes me think, if a client issue only becomes urgent because we haven't nurtured that relationship or anticipated their needs, does it really belong in that quadrant?
That's a fantastic point, and it highlights a key criticism of the matrix. Sometimes the way we categorize tasks reveals deeper problems. We'll dig into those weaknesses later, but for now, let's move on to the next quadrant.
Okay, lead the way.
Go
What's next on our matrix tour?
Next up is important but not urgent. This quadrant is all about strategic thinking and long-term success.
Okay.
Think of tasks like professional development, investing in your relationships, or laying the groundwork for a big project that's months away.
The stuff we know we should be doing, but somehow always gets pushed aside by the daily grind.
Yeah.
I'm definitely guilty of letting this quadrant collect dust sometimes.
And that's precisely why understanding this matrix is so crucial. Eisenhower himself reportedly said, "What is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important." But recognizing the value of this quadrant is only half the battle. We also need to know how to avoid the traps of the others. And that brings us to a quadrant many people struggle with: urgent but not important. This is where those sneaky time wasters often hide.
Ooh, I have a feeling we're about to expose some of my bad habits. What kind of tasks lurk in this deceptively urgent corner?
Think about those emails that feel urgent to answer, but don't actually contribute to your goals, or attending meetings that could have been a quick email exchange. It's responding to other people's sense of urgency instead of staying focused on what truly matters to you.
Oh man, you're reading my mind. I often get sucked into that feeling of being productive when I'm clearing my inbox or attending back-to-back meetings. But at the end of the day, I've barely made a dent in my high-priority work.
That's the urgency trap in action. One of the sources we have, The 4-Hour Workweek by Timothy Ferriss, offers some brilliant strategies for breaking free.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that book.
He suggests setting specific times for checking email, using automation tools to streamline repetitive tasks, and learning to delegate effectively.
That's so helpful. Delegation is something I definitely need to get better at. It's like that old saying, if you want something done right, do it yourself. But if I keep clinging to every task, I'll never have time for the important but not urgent work.
Exactly, which brings us back to the power of that quadrant. While it doesn't have the same immediate pull as urgency, neglecting it can have long-term consequences.
It's almost like this quadrant is a test of our ability to delay gratification.
Right.
We have to resist the temptation of those quick wins and focus on building something meaningful over time.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding the potential downsides of neglecting this quadrant is so important. One of the articles you shared highlights the story of a brilliant entrepreneur who was so focused on putting out fires in his business that he neglected his health and relationship.
Oh, wow.
Ultimately, he achieved great success, but found himself burned out and lonely.
That's a sobering reminder. that success isn't just about checking things off a list.
Hmm.
It's about creating a fulfilling life across all areas. So how do we break free from that cycle of neglecting the important but not urgent?
Well, first we need to get clear on what actually belongs in that quadrant. It's different for everyone, but generally, it includes activities that contribute to our long-term goals and well-being. Things like learning new skills, deepening our relationships, taking care of our physical and mental health, and even making time for personal passions and hobbies.
It's almost like making regular deposits into a life satisfaction bank account.
Right.
We might not see the immediate returns, but over time, those deposits compound into something truly valuable.
I love that analogy, and it highlights the importance of being proactive and intentional about filling this quadrant. We need to schedule those activities in our calendars, just like we would an important meeting or deadline.
That makes so much sense. But I have to admit, I'm still a little stuck on the idea of the urgent and important quadrant.
Mm.
We've talked about how it can be a trap if we're constantly reacting to crises, but isn't there always going to be some level of urgency in life?
That's a great question, and it goes to the heart of one of the most intriguing ideas about the Eisenhower Matrix, the concept of striving for an empty, urgent, and important quadrant.
Okay, now that sounds like a challenge. How is that even possible?
Well, the idea, which we find in Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, is that if we're consistently investing in the important but not urgent quadrant,
Okay.
we can proactively prevent many crises from happening in the first place. Think of it like this. If you're regularly maintaining your car, you're less likely to have a major breakdown that requires emergency repairs.
So it's like we're shifting from a reactive mindset to a proactive one. Instead of constantly putting out fires, we're focusing on fire prevention.
Exactly. And it's not just about preventing crises, it's also about creating space for opportunity. If we're always scrambling to meet urgent deadlines, we're less likely to spot and seize new possibilities that come our way.
This idea of an empty, urgent, and important quadrant is starting to sound less like a fantasy and more like a powerful strategy for living a more intentional and fulfilling life. But I'm also wondering about the other side of the coin. Are there any potential downsides to focusing too heavily on prevention and proactivity?
Right.
Could it lead to overthinking or a fear of taking risks?
That's a brilliant question and speaks to the need for balance. The Eisenhower Matrix isn't a magic bullet, and like any tool, it has its limitations. Even Covey acknowledges that true effectiveness lies in finding the right balance between planning and action, between urgency and importance.
So it sounds like we need to approach this matrix with a healthy dose of critical thinking and adaptability, recognizing that it's a guide, not a rigid set of rules.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point, the potential weaknesses of relying solely on this matrix. While it's a powerful starting point, it doesn't account for the nuances of every situation. For example, sometimes what seems unimportant today could become urgent tomorrow.
That's true. And the matrix doesn't necessarily capture the emotional weight of tasks. Something might be objectively important, but if we're feeling drained or overwhelmed, we might not have the mental bandwidth to tackle it effectively.
Exactly. That's why it's essential to use the Eisenhower Matrix in conjunction with other tools and strategies. Things like time blocking, setting boundaries, and practicing self-care can help us address those emotional and energy-related factors that the Matrix alone doesn't capture.
So it's not about becoming a slave to the matrix, but rather using it as a framework to help us make more conscious choices about how we spend our time and energy.
Precisely. And perhaps that's the most important takeaway from all of this. The Eisenhower Matrix isn't about achieving some elusive state of perfect productivity. It's about gaining clarity, making intentional choices, and ultimately creating a life that reflects our values and priorities.
That's a beautiful way to sum it up. But before we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how we can actually put these insights into practice.
Yeah.
What are some concrete steps we can take to start using this matrix more effectively in our own lives?
That's a great question and one we'll delve into in our next segment. Stay tuned because we're about to get practical.
All right, we've explored the ins and outs of the Eisenhower Matrix, its origins, strengths, and even some potential weaknesses.
Yeah.
But how do we actually use this in our daily lives to feel less overwhelmed and more in control? That's the real test.
Absolutely. It's one thing to understand the theory, but it's another to put it into practice. So where do we begin?
I'm all ears. What's the first step?
Start simple. Grab a piece of paper, or if you're more digitally inclined, open a spreadsheet or a note-taking app. Draw that 2x2 grid importance across the top, urgency down the side, and start slotting in your tasks.
Okay, I can visualize that.
Yeah.
But as we've discussed, Things aren't always black and white. How do we avoid getting stuck in overthinking which quadrant a task belongs to?
You hit the nail on the head. It's about progress, not perfection. Don't get bogged down trying to categorize things with absolute precision. Instead, ask yourself, is this task contributing to my long-term goals? Will it make a real difference a year from now? If the answer is yes, it probably belongs in the important column regardless of its urgency.
So it's more about the big picture impact than the immediate need to check something off the list. That makes sense.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't a one-time exercise. The Eisenhower Matrix is most effective when it's used as an ongoing tool. Make it a habit to revisit your matrix regularly, maybe at the start of each week or even each day, to reassess your priorities and make adjustments as needed.
That makes it feel less overwhelming. It's not about creating a perfect system, but rather having a framework to help us stay focused on what matters.
Precisely. And here's where that concept of the empty, urgent, and important quadrant comes into play. While it might seem impossible to completely eliminate urgent and important tasks, the goal is to proactively manage our time and energy so that fewer things end up in that crisis zone.
So it's not about becoming superhuman, but rather becoming more intentional and strategic.
Exactly. And that might involve making some tough choices. Are you willing to delegate tasks that drain your time and energy? Can you learn to say no to commitments that don't align with your priorities?
Those are great questions to ask ourselves. It's about recognizing that we have limited time and energy, and we need to be mindful of how we're spending those precious resources.
Absolutely. And remember, the Eisenhower Matrix is just one tool in our productivity toolbox. It works best when it's combined with other strategies that address our individual needs and work styles.
Like what? Any specific examples you'd recommend?
One that pairs beautifully with the Matrix is time blocking. Once you've categorized your tasks, schedule dedicated blocks of time in your calendar to focus on those important but not urgent activities. This helps prevent them from getting squeezed out by the tyranny of the urgent.
That's a great tip. I've tried time blocking in the past, and it really does help to create that protected space for the work that often gets neglected.
It can be a game changer. And don't underestimate the power of setting boundaries. Learning to say no to requests or commitments that don't align with your goals is essential for protecting your time and energy.
This all ties back to that idea of being intentional.
Right.
It's about making conscious choices about how we spend our time and energy, instead of just reacting to whatever comes our way.
Exactly. And finally, don't forget the importance of self-care. Rest. Relaxation and activities that bring you joy are not luxuries. They're essential for maintaining your physical, mental, and emotional well-being, which ultimately allows you to show up more fully in all areas of your life.
It's like we've come full circle. We started by talking about how the Eisenhower Matrix can help us achieve our goals, but ultimately it's about creating a life that feels good on a deeper level.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and that's the real power of this deceptively simple tool. It's not about becoming a productivity machine, it's about gaining clarity, making intentional choices, and ultimately designing a life that reflects what truly matters to you.
I love that. So for our listener who's ready to start using the Eisenhower Matrix, what's one small action they can take today to make a real difference?
Here's a challenge. Identify just one thing on your to-do list that's been lingering in the important but not urgent quadrant, and schedule a dedicated block of time to work on it this week. Even just 30 minutes can make a difference. It's a small step, but it's a step in the right direction.
That's a great call to action. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. Be patient with yourself. Experiment with different approaches, and celebrate the small wins along the way.
And don't forget to share your experiences. Connect with others who are using the Eisenhower Matrix. Share your tips and tricks, and support each other on this journey towards a more intentional and fulfilling life.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for this insightful deep dive into the Eisenhower Matrix. We hope you found it helpful and empowering. And remember, the power to create a life you love is in your hands.
It's been a pleasure. Onwards and upwards.